My name is Apollo Restrepo, and I'm a tailor from Portland. When volcanic eruptions worldwide plunged Earth into an ice age apocalypse, my sewing skills became the difference between life and death. For 30 days, I fought to keep survivors warm while gangs hunted me for my abilities. This is how I survived when civilization froze around us. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. March 15th, 2025. I remember that date like it was burned into my memory because that's when everything changed forever. I was working late in my shop, Restrepo Custom Clothiers, on Southeast Hawthorne Boulevard in Portland. The ivory silk wedding dress spread across my cutting table was supposed to be finished by morning, and I was running behind schedule like always. The bride had been planning this dress for 2 years, every detail perfect, every seam exactly where it needed to be. My shop wasn't much to look at from the outside, just another small business squeezed between a coffee shop and a vintage record store in one of Portland's hipster neighborhoods. But inside, it was my sanctuary. 3 generations of sewing knowledge lived in that space. The heavy industrial singer machines my grandfather saved up for, the leather working tools I'd collected over 15 years, bolts of fabric stacked floor to ceiling in organized chaos that only made sense to me. Hand-carved wooden mannequins stood guard like silent sentinels, draped in half-finished jackets and dresses that would never see their intended occasions. The Oregon drizzle painted familiar patterns on my storefront windows that night, same as it had every March for the 12 years since I'd opened the shop. Portland weather was predictable that way. Gray skies, light rain, temperatures in the 40s and 50s. People complained about it, but I'd grown to love the consistency. It meant steady business from people who needed rain gear repaired or wanted custom coats that actually kept them dry. I was Colombian by birth, but Portland had become home after my family immigrated when I was 12. My father died in a construction accident 2 years later, and my grandmother taught me to sew as a way to process the grief. She'd been a seamstress in Medellin, supporting her family through decades of economic uncertainty with nothing but needle and thread. She used to tell me that as long as people needed clothes, a skilled tailor would never go hungry. Those lessons were about more than sewing. They were about survival, about finding purpose in creating something useful with your hands. Over the years, I'd built a reputation for quality work. Bespoke suits for Portland's business elite, wedding dresses for brides who wanted something unique, historical costume recreation for theater companies and Renaissance fairs. I specialized in leather work too, repairing vintage boots and jackets, creating custom pieces that would last decades instead of seasons. Most tailors in the city focused on alterations and quick fixes, but I took on the projects that required real skill, the work that machines couldn't replicate. My basement workshop held my camping gear from weekend trips to the Cascades. Sleeping bags, tents, portable camp stoves, freeze-dried food supplies I'd accumulated over years of hiking. I wasn't a prepper or anything dramatic like that, just someone who enjoyed getting outdoors when Portland's urban pace became overwhelming. The gear sat down there collecting dust most of the time, but I maintained it carefully. Good equipment was expensive, and taking care of it meant it would be ready when I needed it. The shop's south-facing windows caught morning sun better than most buildings on the block, and I'd invested in proper insulation when I first leased the space. Portland's heating costs could kill a small business if you weren't careful, and maintaining consistent temperature was crucial for working with delicate fabrics. The building stayed comfortable even when neighboring shops turned into ice boxes during cold snaps. That night, as I worked on the wedding dress, I had the radio playing softly in the background. Local jazz station, nothing too distracting. The news update came on at 11 o'clock, and I almost missed it because I was focused on setting a particularly difficult sleeve. Something about volcanic activity in Italy, Mount Vesuvius showing unusual seismic readings. scientists monitoring the situation but no immediate danger to populated areas. I didn't think much of it. Volcanoes erupted somewhere in the world every few months, and Italy was thousands of miles away from Oregon. I had a dress to finish, and 3 suit alterations scheduled for the next morning. Local problems took priority over international geological events that wouldn't affect my small corner of the world. By midnight, I'd finished the major seaming on the dress and started the detailed beadwork around the neckline. Tedious work that required absolute focus, but satisfying in the way that only hand craftsmanship could be. Each bead placed exactly where the design required, secured with tiny stitches that would hold for decades. This was the kind of work that separated real tailors from people who just owned sewing machines. The radio news update at 1 in the morning mentioned Vesuvius again, but this time the tone was different. The volcano had erupted, and it wasn't the gentle lava flows that tourists usually associated with Italian volcanoes. This was what geologists called a Plinian eruption, shooting ash and gas 30 miles into the atmosphere. European air traffic was being diverted, and ash clouds were spreading across the Mediterranean. I paused my beadwork for a moment, thinking about the historical implications. Vesuvius had destroyed Pompeii in 79 AD, preserving an entire Roman city under volcanic ash. The thought was academically interesting, but Portland felt safely isolated from European geological disasters. We had our own earthquake risks living near the Cascadia subduction zone, but volcanic eruptions weren't on the list of things that kept Pacific Northwest residents awake at night. The 2 o'clock news brought more concerning reports. Yellowstone's seismic monitoring stations were registering unusual activity. The supervolcano that most Americans knew about from disaster movies, but never seriously considered as a real threat, was showing signs of instability. Scientists were calling it coincidence, emphasizing that Yellowstone had been monitored for decades without any genuine eruption risk. I finished the beadwork on the wedding dress as the 3 o'clock update came through. Mount Tambora in Indonesia had erupted, then Mount Unzen in Japan. Volcanic activity across the Pacific Ring of Fire was spiking simultaneously in ways that geological surveys had never recorded. Scientists were struggling to explain the coordinated nature of the eruptions, but they assured the public that these were separate events without direct causal relationships. The wedding dress looked perfect under my work lights. Months of planning, measuring, and careful construction had produced exactly what the bride envisioned. I hung it carefully on a padded hanger, protecting the delicate beadwork and ensuring the silk wouldn't wrinkle overnight. In 12 hours, a young woman would wear this dress for the most important day of her life, trusting that my craftsmanship would make her feel beautiful and confident. 4 o'clock brought news that changed everything. Yellowstone's caldera had erupted. Not the gentle geothermal activity that fed the park's famous geysers, but a catastrophic supereruption that was launching volcanic material into the jet stream. Emergency services across Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho were evacuating populations as ash began falling like gray snow across the Rocky Mountain region. I turned off my work lights and locked up the shop, but I couldn't sleep. Instead, I sat in my small apartment above the workspace, watching news coverage on my laptop. Satellite images showed massive ash clouds spreading eastward from Yellowstone, but the wind patterns were complex. Weather systems were pushing volcanic material in directions that meteorologists hadn't predicted. The 5 o'clock update mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Multiple volcanic eruptions occurring simultaneously across different continents wasn't coincidence. Geological pressure systems that had remained stable for thousands of years were failing at the same time, suggesting systemic changes in tectonic activity that scientists didn't fully understand. Portland residents woke up that morning to news reports that sounded like science fiction. Volcanic ash from multiple sources was creating atmospheric conditions not seen since the last ice age. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere were dropping as ash clouds blocked solar radiation. Agricultural regions were reporting crop failures as plants couldn't photosynthesize under the darkened skies. I opened my shop at 8 o'clock that morning, same as always. The bride arrived at 9 for her final fitting, but she was distracted and anxious. Her wedding was scheduled for the following weekend, but her family was questioning whether it was safe to travel from Seattle with volcanic ash affecting air quality across the Pacific Northwest. We went through the fitting mechanically, both of us trying to maintain normalcy while the news played constantly in the background. The temperature outside was dropping noticeably. Portland's March weather usually hovered around 50 degrees, but by noon it was struggling to reach 40. The ash hadn't reached Oregon yet, but the atmospheric effects were already changing our local climate. I found myself turning up the heat in the shop, grateful for the insulation and southern exposure that kept my workspace comfortable. Maya, the 10-year-old girl from the apartment building next door, stopped by after school like she often did. Her mother worked double shifts as a nurse, and I'd gotten into the habit of teaching Maya basic sewing techniques to keep her occupied until her mom got home. She was a quick learner, fascinated by the process of transforming flat fabric into three-dimensional clothing. That afternoon, I taught her how to thread a needle properly and make even running stitches, skills that seemed quaint and old-fashioned, but satisfied her curiosity about how things were made. The evening news painted a picture of global catastrophe. Ash clouds from the coordinated volcanic eruptions were merging in the upper atmosphere, creating a worldwide phenomenon that climate scientists were comparing to nuclear winter. The ash was blocking sunlight across entire continents, causing temperature drops that would affect growing seasons and weather patterns for years to come. I walked through my neighborhood that evening, observing how quickly things were changing. The coffee shop next door had lines of people buying supplies, stocking up on non-perishable goods as if preparing for a hurricane. The grocery stores were crowded with anxious shoppers clearing shelves of canned food, batteries, and camping supplies. Portland residents weren't accustomed to emergency preparations beyond earthquake kits, but the scope of the volcanic crisis was forcing everyone to consider possibilities they'd never imagined. My shop felt like an island of calm amid the growing chaos. The familiar sense of wool and leather, the precise organization of tools and materials, the quiet satisfaction of skilled handwork provided comfort that the outside world no longer offered. I spent the evening taking inventory of my supplies, counting bolts of fabric, leather hides, thread, and notions with the methodical attention I usually reserved for complex sewing projects. The basement workshop contained more resources than I'd realized. Camping equipment from years of weekend trips, emergency food supplies, a portable generator I'd bought after a power outage the previous winter, water filtration equipment, first aid supplies, tools for repairing outdoor gear. I wasn't a survivalist, just someone who believed in being prepared for Pacific Northwest weather emergencies, but my casual preparations were starting to look prescient. March 20th brought the first real temperature drop. Overnight lows fell into the 20s, unprecedented for Portland in March. The city's infrastructure wasn't designed for extended freezing temperatures, and reports of burst pipes and heating system failures started coming in by mid-morning. My shop's insulation and heating system handled the cold without problems, but I could see my neighbors struggling with buildings that weren't designed for serious winter weather. The bride called to cancel her wedding. Her voice was apologetic but firm. With ash clouds affecting air travel and temperatures dropping across the region, she couldn't ask family members to travel for a ceremony that might be dangerous. The dress I'd spent months creating hung unused in my shop, a symbol of normalcy that no longer existed. Other appointments started canceling too. Business meetings, social events, routine alterations that seemed frivolous when survival was becoming a daily concern. I found myself with unusual amounts of free time, which I used to organize my materials, and consider how my skills might be relevant in a world that was changing faster than anyone could predict. Maya visited after school on March 21st, but she seemed subdued and worried. Her mother had told her about the global situation in age-appropriate terms, explaining that the world was going through difficult changes that would affect everyone's daily lives. I continued teaching her sewing techniques, focusing on practical skills like mending tears and reinforcing weak seams. The lessons felt more important now, less like casual entertainment and more like knowledge that might actually matter. The news that evening confirmed what I'd been suspecting. The volcanic ash was creating atmospheric conditions that would persist for months, possibly years. Agricultural production was collapsing as crops failed across major growing regions. Supply chains were breaking down as transportation systems struggled with reduced visibility and equipment failures caused by ash contamination. The comfortable modern world that took abundant resources for granted was grinding to a halt. I made a decision that night that would define everything that followed. Instead of closing the shop and waiting for conditions to improve, I would adapt my skills to meet the new reality. If the world was entering a prolonged period of scarcity and cold weather, people would need practical clothing that could be made and repaired by hand. My grandmother's lessons about survival through skilled craftsmanship were about to become relevant in ways she never could have imagined. March 22nd brought snow to Portland. Not the light dusting that occasionally surprised residents in winter, but heavy, persistent snowfall that accumulated throughout the day. The city's snow removal equipment was minimal, designed for occasional use rather than sustained winter weather. Traffic slowed to a crawl, and many businesses closed early as conditions deteriorated. My first desperate customer arrived that afternoon. Mrs. Chen from the apartment building across the street knocked on my door as I was watching the snow pile up against my windows. Her heating system had failed, and she needed something warmer than the light jackets designed for Portland's mild climate. I looked at her thin coat and realized she was facing a life-threatening situation. I had heavy curtain material in my storage room, thick wool that a theater company had ordered but never picked up. Working entirely by hand, I cut and stitched a makeshift coat that would provide real warmth and wind protection. The construction was crude compared to my usual standards, but it was functional and potentially life-saving. Mrs. Chen paid me with information about which buildings in the neighborhood still had working heating systems, knowledge that was becoming more valuable than money. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood network. The tailor on Hawthorne could make warm clothes from whatever materials were available. By March 25th, I had a steady stream of visitors bringing fabric scraps, old blankets, and damaged winter gear that needed repair or modification. I worked by lamplight when the power went out, using hand tools and techniques that most modern tailors had forgotten. The power grid failed completely on March 31st. One moment I was working under electric lights, and the next the shop was silent and dark. The constant hum of modern life, so familiar that it had become invisible, disappeared permanently. I lit candles and continued working, but I knew that electric sewing machines and industrial equipment were now obsolete. Everything would have to be done by hand, the way my grandmother had worked in Colombia when resources were scarce and reliability mattered more than speed. That was when I understood that this wasn't temporary. The world we'd known was gone, replaced by something colder and darker and more demanding than any of us had prepared for. But as I sat in my candle-lit workshop, surrounded by the tools and materials that could keep people alive through the long winter ahead, I realized that my grandmother had been right all along. As long as people needed clothes, a skilled tailor would never go hungry. The question now was whether my skills would be enough to keep not just myself alive, but the growing number of people who were starting to depend on what I could create with needle and thread. The silence after the power died was something I'll never forget. For 36 years, I'd lived with the constant background hum of electricity, and suddenly it was gone. The refrigerator stopped humming, the heating system went quiet, and my electric sewing machines became expensive paperweights. April 5th arrived with temperatures that should have been spring-like, but instead hovered just above freezing. The volcanic ash was doing exactly what the scientists had predicted, blocking enough sunlight to fundamentally change our climate. Working entirely by hand was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. My grandmother could sew for 12 hours straight without complaint, but I'd grown dependent on electric machines to do the heavy lifting. Hand-stitching thick wool or leather required muscles I'd forgotten I had. My fingers cramped constantly, and my shoulders ached from hunching over work surfaces lit only by candles and oil lamps. But there was something deeply satisfying about the rhythm of hand sewing, the meditative quality of creating something useful one stitch at a time. The physical demands were nothing compared to the mental pressure. Every day brought new requests from desperate neighbors who needed warm clothes, but had little to trade except information, small favors, or the promise of future help. I was rationing my materials carefully, knowing that supply deliveries weren't coming back anytime soon. Each decision about who got what resources felt like I was choosing who would survive the winter and who wouldn't. Water became a daily challenge after the pumps failed. I melted snow in pots over my camping stove, filtering it through cloth to remove ash particles that were starting to show up in the precipitation. The routine was time-consuming and fuel-intensive, but clean water was essential for both drinking and the cloth dyeing work that was becoming increasingly important. Natural dyes required specific water chemistry, and contaminated water could ruin entire batches of fabric. Food rationing had become a constant calculation. The emergency supplies in my basement were substantial, but feeding myself and occasionally helping neighbors meant everything had to be carefully measured and planned. I'd started a journal tracking every meal, every trade, every resource expenditure because miscalculating meant starvation. The freeze-dried camping meals were calorie-dense and long-lasting, but they required water that was becoming precious itself. That's when Mrs. Chen knocked on my door again, but this time she wasn't alone. She brought her neighbor, an elderly man named Robert whose grandson had frozen to death during the first week of power failures. Robert needed something I'd never made before and hoped I'd never have to make again. A burial shroud for a child. The boy was only 8 years old, and there were no funeral homes operating, no proper burial clothing available through normal channels. I used silk lining material that was meant for the inside of expensive jackets, cream-colored fabric with a subtle texture that felt appropriate for such a somber purpose. Working on that small shroud was one of the hardest things I'd ever done professionally. Every stitch was a reminder of how quickly everything had changed, how the normal protections of civilization had evaporated in just 2 weeks. Robert paid me with information about which apartment buildings in the downtown area still had residents, and which ones had been abandoned as people fled the city or died from exposure. The emotional weight of that work stayed with me for days. I'd spent my career making clothing for celebrations, special occasions, moments when people wanted to look their best. Wedding dresses, graduation suits, anniversary outfits that marked happy milestones in normal lives. But now I was making burial clothes for children and survival gear for adults who were facing life-or-death situations every single day. By April 8th, word had spread far enough that I had lines of people outside my shop every morning. Not long lines, because the total population of the neighborhood was dropping as people died or left the city, but a steady stream of desperate individuals who needed clothing that could keep them alive in conditions that Portland had never experienced before. The requests were heartbreaking and impossible. Turn summer dresses into winter coats, make snow boots from sneakers and carpet scraps, create insulated sleeping bags from curtains and old blankets. I was learning to work with materials that no traditional tailor would ever consider. Car seat leather was actually excellent for outer garments because it was already treated to resist moisture and wear. Carpet padding made surprisingly effective insulation when sandwiched between layers of fabric. Sleeping bag fill could be redistributed into clothing that provided targeted warmth for core body areas. These weren't techniques taught in any sewing school, but they were keeping people alive. Maya was becoming an invaluable assistant during this period. Her small fingers could handle detail work that my increasingly arthritic hands struggled with, and she absorbed sewing techniques with the intensity of someone who understood that these skills might determine her survival. I started teaching her more advanced techniques, not just basic stitching but pattern making, fabric selection, and the logic behind garment construction. Someone needed to know these things besides me, and Maya was proving to be naturally talented at work that required patience and precision. The bartering system that was developing around my shop became increasingly complex. Clothing repair and creation were valuable services, but people needed many different things to survive. I started facilitating trades between customers, using my shop as an informal marketplace where information and resources could be exchanged. Mrs. Chen knew which buildings had working fireplaces. Robert had contacts with people who were scavenging food from abandoned grocery stores. A former restaurant owner named David had preserved food supplies and cooking equipment. Marcus the mechanic became one of my most important trading partners during this period. He could repair and maintain vehicles when fuel was available, but more importantly, he understood heating systems, generators, and the mechanical aspects of survival that were beyond my expertise. I repaired his leatherwork clothes and waterproof gear in exchange for vehicle maintenance and helped securing my shop against break-ins that were becoming increasingly common. Dr. Sarah Martinez was another crucial alliance. She was running a clinic out of her home, treating everything from hypothermia to injuries from scavenging accidents. But she needed specialized supplies that weren't available through normal medical channels. I could create surgical quality sutures from silk thread, medical textiles from carefully sterilized fabric, and bandages that would hold up under harsh conditions. In exchange, she treated my work-related injuries and helped me understand the medical aspects of cold weather survival. The moral dilemmas were becoming unbearable. When you have enough material to make one warm coat, and 3 people desperately need protection from freezing temperatures, how do you decide who lives and who dies? I developed a priority system that tried to balance practical utility with basic humanity. Children first, because they were most vulnerable to cold and represented the future of whatever community might survive. Then elderly people who had valuable knowledge and experience. Then working adults who could contribute to group survival efforts. But priority systems meant turning people away, and I'll never forget the face of a pregnant woman who came to my shop on April 10th when I'd run out of suitable materials for maternity winter wear. She was maybe 6 months along, clearly struggling with malnutrition and cold exposure, and I had to tell her to come back in 3 days when I might have supplies. I gave her what warm clothing I could spare from my personal items, but it wasn't enough, and we both knew it. That same week, I started noticing the same faces walking past my shop repeatedly. Not customers or neighbors, but strangers who seemed to be observing my operation with professional interest. They were noting when I opened and closed, how many people visited each day, what kinds of goods were being traded. The attention made me nervous because valuable resources and skilled services were attracting predators who would rather steal than trade. I began moving my most valuable tools to a secondary location, a friend's basement workshop 6 blocks away, where I could continue working if something happened to my primary shop. The setup was crude, just basic hand tools and a small selection of materials, but it was completely hidden and could serve as a backup if raiders targeted my main location. I didn't tell anyone except Maya about the secondary workshop, and I made her promise to remember the location if we ever became separated. Teaching others to repair and maintain clothing became a survival necessity rather than a courtesy. There weren't enough skilled tailors in the city to handle everyone's needs, and materials were too scarce to replace items that could be mended instead. I started group lessons in basic garment repair, showing people how to patch holes, reinforce wear points, and extend the life of clothing that might be irreplaceable. The former art teacher who'd been living in the apartment building next door turned out to have excellent spatial reasoning skills that translated well to pattern making. I taught her how to create basic clothing patterns from measurements, and she helped me develop more efficient ways to cut multiple garments from limited fabric supplies. Her background in visual arts made her particularly good at maximizing material usage and minimizing waste. The information network that was developing around these trading relationships became almost as valuable as the physical goods being exchanged. People shared knowledge about safe routes through the city, which areas were controlled by organized gangs, where to find scavenging opportunities, and which government emergency services were still functioning. My shop became an informal communications hub, because people trusted the neutrality of someone who was providing essential services rather than competing for scarce resources. But that trust and visibility were making me increasingly vulnerable. By April 15th, it was clear that organized groups were taking over resource-rich locations throughout Portland. The gangs weren't just opportunistic criminals. They were establishing territorial control and demanding tribute from anyone who wanted to operate within their areas. A group calling themselves the Frozen had taken over several apartment complexes downtown and were forcing residents to hand over 50% of their food and fuel supplies in exchange for protection. I was hearing stories about coordinated raids on locations that had valuable supplies or skilled workers. Medical clinics were being robbed of drugs and equipment. Mechanics were being forced to work exclusively for gang members. Anyone who had something worth taking was becoming a target, and my operation was definitely worth taking. Quality clothing, leather working tools, and textile supplies were incredibly valuable in a world where replacement Wasson goods weren't being manufactured or distributed. Dr. Sarah started treating victims of gang violence during this period, and the injuries she described were systematic and brutal. These weren't random muggings or desperate people grabbing supplies. This was organized intimidation designed to establish control over remaining resources and skilled workers. People who resisted were beaten severely enough to serve as examples to others who might consider defying gang demands. Maya mentioned during one of our sewing lessons that she'd seen the same 3 men walking past the shop several days in a row, always at different times but clearly observing our operation. They weren't customers, and they weren't neighbors. They were dressed better than most survivors, and they carried themselves with the confidence of people who weren't worried about where their next meal was coming from. The implication was obvious. They were scouts for one of the organized gangs, gathering intelligence about potential targets. I started varying my schedule, opening and closing the shop at different times to make surveillance more difficult. I also began keeping more supplies hidden and maintaining smaller quantities of visible materials that might be acceptable losses if theft became inevitable. The most valuable tools were already secured in the secondary workshop, but everyday materials and work-in-progress projects were still vulnerable to raids. The psychological pressure was becoming as challenging as the physical demands of survival. Every knock on the door might be a desperate customer who needed help, or it might be scouts preparing for a raid. Every person who asked detailed questions about my supplies or capabilities might be planning to share that information with people who would use it against me. The paranoia was exhausting, but it was also keeping me alive. Robert, the elderly man whose grandson had died, brought me disturbing news on April 17th. The Frozen had approached him about the neighborhood's resources and skilled workers. They were particularly interested in anyone who could provide winter clothing, medical care, or mechanical services. He'd managed to avoid giving specific information, but they'd made it clear that cooperation was expected rather than optional. The implicit threat was obvious. join their organization and work under their protection, or face the consequences of trying to operate independently in territory they considered theirs. But protection meant giving up control over who received my services and what I was paid for my work. It meant making warm clothes for gang members while their victims froze to death. It meant becoming part of a system that was based on violence and exploitation rather than mutual aid and fair exchange. I spent that night taking inventory of everything I owned and considering my options. Fighting was suicide. I was a middle-aged tailor, not a soldier or martial artist. Running meant abandoning the shop, the materials, and the people who depended on my services. Joining meant becoming complicit in a system that represented everything I opposed about how people should treat each other during disasters. But there was a third option that I was reluctant to consider. Instead of operating as an isolated individual, I could try to organize the people who benefited from my services into a mutual defense network. Marcus had mechanical skills and physical tools that could be useful in a confrontation. Dr. Sarah had medical knowledge and supplies that made her valuable to any group. David had food supplies and cooking equipment that people needed. Maya's mother had nursing skills that were essential for treating injuries. The idea terrified me because it meant acknowledging that violence was inevitable and preparing to participate in it. But the alternative was watching everything I'd built be destroyed by people who would use my skills to strengthen their control over other survivors. As I sat in my candle-lit shop that night, surrounded by the tools and materials that represented 3 generations of craftsmanship knowledge, I realized that some things were worth fighting for. The next morning brought news that made the decision for me. The Frozen had raided Dr. Sarah's clinic during the night, taking most of her medical supplies and giving her an ultimatum: join their organization and provide medical services exclusively to gang members, or lose access to the remaining medical supplies she needed to help other people. She'd refused, and they'd promised to return with a more convincing argument. That afternoon, Maya ran into the shop with tears in her eyes. 3 men had cornered her on the way home from school, asking detailed questions about what I kept in the shop and when I was usually alone. They'd offered her food and warm clothes in exchange for information about my daily routines and security measures. She'd refused and run away, but the message was clear. They were preparing for something, and they were gathering intelligence to make sure it succeeded. I realized then that I'd been thinking about this situation wrong. I wasn't just a tailor trying to survive independently. I was the center of a network of people who were depending on each other for survival. And protecting that network was more important than protecting myself individually. Mrs. Chen, Robert, Marcus, Dr. Sarah, Maya, David, and dozens of others were connected through the services and trades that flowed through my shop. Destroying me meant destroying all of those relationships and leaving vulnerable people with nowhere to turn for help. That night, I started planning not just for my own survival, but for the defense of everything we'd built together over the past month. I should have known they were watching us, learning our routines and planning their approach. But I was about to learn that sometimes the only way to protect something worth saving is to fight for it, even when you never wanted to be a fighter. The morning after Maya's encounter with those 3 men, I knew everything had to change. April 15th brought a cold rain mixed with ash that turned the streets into gray slush, and I spent the early hours moving my most valuable tools and materials to the secondary workshop location. Marcus helped me carry the heavy leather working equipment and industrial scissors that would be impossible to replace, while Maya kept watch from the front window to warn us if anyone was approaching the shop. The fortification work began immediately. Marcus understood structural reinforcement better than anyone I knew, and he'd been anticipating this kind of trouble for weeks. We installed heavier locks on all the doors and reinforced the window frames with metal brackets salvaged from abandoned construction sites. The basement entrance was completely concealed behind a false wall made from old furniture and fabric bolts, creating a hidden space where people could take shelter if the main shop was compromised. But physical security was only part of the solution. The real strength would come from organizing the people who depended on my services into a mutual defense network. Dr. Sarah was completely supportive of the idea after losing most of her medical supplies to the Frozen's raid. She understood better than anyone that isolated individuals were easy targets, but organized groups could protect each other through coordinated resistance and shared resources. Marcus brought practical military knowledge to our planning sessions. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before becoming a mechanic, and he understood small unit tactics in ways that civilian survivors couldn't. His approach was methodical and realistic about what we could accomplish with limited weapons and untrained personnel. Most importantly, he emphasized that our goal should be deterrence rather than direct confrontation whenever possible. The daily gatherings at my shop evolved into informal community meetings where information was shared and collective decisions were made. 20 to 30 people were regularly participating in the network by mid-April, including several families with children who were particularly vulnerable to both the cold weather and organized predators. The group included diverse skills and resources that complemented each other in ways that none of us could have achieved individually. Mrs. Chen had become our intelligence coordinator without any formal appointment to that role. She had contacts throughout the Asian community in Southeast Portland, and her information about gang movements and resource availability was consistently accurate and timely. Her apartment building was strategically located with good sight lines of major streets, making it an ideal observation post for monitoring potential threats to our area. Robert's knowledge of the downtown area was proving invaluable as we tried to understand the Frozen's territorial claims and operational patterns. He'd lived in Portland for 40 years and knew the building layouts, underground passages, and hidden access routes that could be crucial for movement and communication if open travel became too dangerous. His contacts with other elderly residents provided information about which areas were still relatively safe. David, the former restaurant owner, had established relationships with other food suppliers and was coordinating distribution of preserved goods among network members. His background in commercial food service meant he understood inventory management and could help us avoid the waste that could prove fatal when replacement supplies weren't available. More importantly, he was willing to share his resources rather than hoarding them for personal survival. The shop itself was becoming something different from what it had been during the first month after the power failed. Instead of just a place where I provided tailoring services, it was evolving into a community center where people came for information, mutual support, and collective planning. The daily rhythm included scheduled work sessions where multiple people could learn clothing repair techniques, group meals where food was shared equitably, and evening discussions about security and resource management. Maya was progressing remarkably quickly in her sewing skills, but more importantly, she was developing leadership abilities that surprised everyone, including her mother. She could coordinate group activities, mediate disputes between adults, and remember complex information about people's needs and capabilities. I started teaching her not just advanced sewing techniques, but also the reasoning behind resource allocation decisions and the communication skills needed to build consensus among people with different priorities. The instruction manual I was creating had evolved from simple sewing directions into a comprehensive guide for maintaining clothing and textiles under survival conditions. The manual included detailed drawings showing repair techniques, information about alternative materials and their properties, and instructions for creating tools and equipment from scavenged supplies. Most importantly, it contained the accumulated knowledge that would allow someone else to continue providing essential services if something happened to me. But the growing strength and organization of our network was also making us more visible to predatory groups who saw successful cooperation as a threat to their control strategies. The Frozen's business model depended on desperate individuals who had no alternatives to accepting their protection arrangements. Our mutual aid network demonstrated that people could organize themselves for survival without submitting to gang authority, which undermined their claim that protection services were worth 50% of everyone's resources. The first direct confrontation came on April 18th when 4 members of the Frozen entered my shop during normal business hours and demanded to inspect my supplies and customer records. They were armed with knives and crowbars, and they made it clear that resistance would result in immediate violence. But they weren't expecting to find Marcus, David, and 2 other network members present as part of our new security protocols. The standoff lasted nearly an hour, with both sides trying to avoid escalation while making their positions clear. The gang members wanted detailed information about our resources, our membership, and our daily routines. They also demanded that I begin providing clothing services exclusively to their organization in exchange for protection from other threats. The alternative, they explained, was having my shop destroyed and my materials redistributed to people who understood the realities of survival in their territory. Our response was carefully coordinated and measured. We refused to provide information about our network or accept their protection arrangement, but we also avoided direct threats or actions that would justify immediate retaliation. Marcus did most of the talking because his military background gave him credibility in negotiations with people who respected force above other considerations. The message we delivered was simple but firm. We would defend ourselves if attacked, but we preferred to resolve conflicts through negotiation and mutual respect. The gang members left without taking anything or injuring anyone, but they made it clear that our refusal was being noted and would have consequences. They also mentioned specific details about our daily routines that proved they'd been conducting surveillance for longer than we'd realized. They knew when I opened and closed the shop, which routes network members used for travel, and how many people were typically present during different parts of the day. That evening, we held an emergency meeting to discuss security improvements and contingency planning. The consensus was that direct conflict was inevitable, but we needed to choose the timing and circumstances rather than allowing the Frozen to dictate when and how confrontation would occur. Our advantages included detailed knowledge of the local area, strong relationships with neighborhood residents, and the motivation that comes from defending something valuable rather than trying to take someone else's resources. The secondary workshop location became crucial to our planning during this period. The basement space was completely hidden and could serve as a coordination center if our main gathering place was compromised. I moved additional supplies there, including medical equipment from Dr. Sarah's clinic and communication, devices that Marcus had salvaged from abandoned vehicles. Most importantly, I created duplicate copies of the instruction manual and stored them in multiple locations, so the knowledge would survive even if individual network members didn't. Maya's role in our security planning was more important than her age would suggest. She could move through the neighborhood without attracting attention, and her presence in places where adults would be noticed and questioned. She became our primary messenger for communicating with network members who lived outside the immediate area, and she was responsible for implementing evacuation procedures if our main meeting locations became unsafe. The psychological pressure of preparing for violence was affecting everyone differently. Some network members were energized by the sense of purpose and collective action, while others were struggling with anxiety and fear about the potential consequences of resistance. Dr. Sarah was treating increased cases of stress-related symptoms, and we had to balance security preparations with maintaining the morale and cohesion that made our cooperation possible in the first place. Teaching advanced skills became more urgent as we realized that individual network members might need to operate independently for extended periods. I accelerated Maya's training in complex garment construction and repair techniques, while Marcus taught basic mechanical skills to anyone who was interested in learning. Dr. Sarah conducted first aid training sessions that focused on treating injuries that might result from either accidents or intentional violence. The intelligence that Mrs. Chen was gathering painted a disturbing picture of the Frozen's expansion throughout southeast Portland. They were systematically targeting anyone who had valuable skills or resources, using a combination of intimidation and violence to force compliance with their protection arrangements. Medical professionals, mechanics, people with food supplies, and anyone who could provide essential services were being recruited or eliminated as independent operators. But there were also signs that their rapid expansion was creating internal problems. Managing territory and personnel required organizational skills that street criminals didn't necessarily possess, and there were reports of conflicts between different gang factions over resource allocation and operational authority. Some people who'd initially accepted protection arrangements were beginning to question whether the costs justified the benefits, especially as gang demands increased over time. Our network's reputation was spreading beyond the immediate neighborhood as word got out about successful resistance to gang recruitment efforts. Other groups of survivors were asking for advice about organizing mutual defense networks, and some were requesting direct assistance with security planning and resource sharing arrangements. The attention was flattering, but it also meant that our activities were becoming known to people who might share information with hostile groups. The moral complexity of our situation was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. We were preparing to use violence against people who were also just trying to survive in impossible conditions, and the distinction between legitimate defense and aggressive expansion wasn't always clear. The Frozen's members weren't cartoon villains. They were desperate people who'd chosen a different survival strategy than mutual cooperation and resource sharing. But the stories that Dr. Sarah was hearing from people who'd escaped gang control made it clear that their protection arrangements were based on systematic exploitation rather than genuine mutual benefit. Protection payments were increasing over time, and people who couldn't meet their obligations were being abandoned during medical emergencies or excluded from food distribution. The gang's success depended on maintaining scarcity and dependence rather than building genuine community resilience. On April 22nd, we received intelligence that the Frozen was planning coordinated raids on several locations that had refused their protection arrangements. My shop was definitely on the target list, along with Dr. Sarah's clinic and Marcus's garage workspace. The attacks were scheduled for different nights over the following week, designed to avoid giving targeted groups time to coordinate defensive responses or escape with valuable resources. The warning came from an unexpected source. A teenager whose family had initially accepted gang protection had become disillusioned with their demands and was secretly providing information to resistance groups. He couldn't completely abandon his family's protection arrangement without putting them at risk, but he was willing to share intelligence that might help other people avoid the trap his family had fallen into. We spent the next 3 days implementing emergency procedures and preparing for siege conditions. Additional supplies were moved to secure locations. Communication protocols were established with allied groups in other neighborhoods, and detailed plans were made for evacuation and regrouping if our primary locations became untenable. Everyone understood that our choices had narrowed to successful resistance or complete submission to gang authority. Maya demonstrated remarkable maturity during this preparation period. She helped coordinate supply movements, memorized complex evacuation routes, and practiced the communication protocols that would be essential if network leadership was eliminated during the initial attacks. Her mother was terrified about involving a child in adult conflicts, but Maya insisted that she understood the stakes and wanted to contribute to defending the community that had kept her family alive. The instruction manual was distributed to multiple network members during this period, ensuring that essential knowledge would survive even if key individuals were killed or captured during the confrontation. I also created detailed inventories of all supplies and equipment, noting where items were stored and how they could be accessed by survivors who might need to rebuild community services after the immediate crisis was resolved. But even as we prepared for the worst possible outcomes, I was hopeful that our organization and preparation would be enough to deter attack entirely. The frozen strategy depended on targeting isolated individuals who had no choice but to accept protection arrangements. A well-organized group that was prepared to defend itself represented a different category of challenge, one that might not be worth the costs and risks of direct confrontation. The evening of April 24th brought reports that the Frozen was moving additional personnel into our area and conducting final reconnaissance of target locations. Mrs. Chen observed unusual activity around gang-safe houses, and network members reported seeing armed groups conducting what appeared to be rehearsals for coordinated operations. The intelligence suggested that attacks would begin within 48 hours. I spent that night checking and rechecking every aspect of our defensive preparations, knowing that mistakes or oversights could result in deaths among people who trusted me to help keep them safe. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. Everything we'd built together over the past month was worth defending, and the alternative to resistance was watching it be destroyed by people who valued control more than cooperation. As I sat in my fortified shop that night, surrounded by the tools and materials that represented not just my livelihood but the foundation of our community's survival, I reflected on how much had changed since March 15th. I'd gone from being an independent craftsman to being a reluctant leader of a mutual defense network, and tomorrow would determine whether our cooperation was strong enough to protect what we'd created together. I should have known that they were watching us, learning our routines, and planning their approach with the methodical patience of predators who understood that successful attacks required careful preparation. But what they didn't know was that we'd been preparing too, and we were about to find out whether people fighting to protect something they'd built together could overcome people who were fighting to take what others had created. July 1st arrived with something that should have been impossible in Portland: snow. Not the light flurries that occasionally surprised residents during winter months, but heavy, persistent snowfall that accumulated throughout the morning and showed no signs of stopping. I stood at my reinforced shop windows watching the impossible weather and trying to process what it meant for our survival prospects. Summer snow in the Pacific Northwest wasn't just unusual. It was a clear sign that the volcanic winter was going to be far more severe and long-lasting than even the most pessimistic scientists had predicted. The psychological impact on the community was immediate and devastating. During the past 3 months, people had been holding onto hope that conditions would improve once the initial shock of the volcanic eruptions wore off. Summer was supposed to bring warmer temperatures, longer days, and maybe the beginning of agricultural recovery. Instead, we were watching snow fall in July, and everyone understood that this meant our situation was permanent rather than temporary. Dr. Sarah reported a sharp increase in cases of severe depression and anxiety, as the reality of our circumstances became undeniable. People who'd been functioning reasonably well under the assumption that rescue or recovery was coming were struggling to adjust to the knowledge that this was our new world indefinitely. The medical supplies for treating mental health conditions had been exhausted weeks ago, and she was relying on counseling techniques and community support systems that weren't adequate for the scale of psychological trauma we were dealing with. The snow accumulation was creating immediate practical problems that our survival network hadn't anticipated. The improvised heating systems that had been adequate for spring temperatures weren't sufficient for winter weather conditions, and fuel supplies that we'd expected to last through summer were being consumed at rates that would leave us completely without heat by September. Food preservation was becoming more difficult as temperatures fluctuated unpredictably, and the ash mixed with precipitation was contaminating water sources faster than our filtration systems could handle. Marcus was working around the clock to modify heating systems and improve insulation in the buildings where network members were living. His mechanical skills were essential, but the demand for his services was overwhelming his capacity to help everyone who needed assistance. We started organizing work crews to help with heating system modifications, but most of the technical knowledge required specialized training that couldn't be taught quickly enough to meet immediate needs. The clothing demands were becoming impossible to meet with available materials and production capacity. Everyone needed winter weight garments immediately, but I was already working 18 hours a day and had exhausted most of the heavy fabric supplies that were suitable for cold weather protection. Maya was helping with simple construction tasks, but complex garments required skills and experience that couldn't be transferred quickly enough to address the crisis. I made the difficult decision to implement emergency rationing protocols that prioritized children and elderly network members for the warmest clothing, while adults received basic protection that might not be adequate for extended cold exposure. The moral weight of these decisions was crushing, knowing that inadequate clothing could mean death for people who trusted our network to provide essential survival resources. The secondary workshop became crucial during this period, as demand exceeded the capacity of my main shop location. I was dividing time between both locations, moving materials and equipment based on immediate needs and security considerations. Maya was responsible for coordinating between the two workshops, carrying messages and small supplies while helping to maintain operational continuity when I couldn't be in both places simultaneously. July 5th brought the blizzard that changed everything about our survival situation. The storm lasted 18 hours and deposited nearly 2 feet of snow in an area that typically saw light snow only a few days each winter. The wind speeds were high enough to cause structural damage to buildings that weren't designed for serious winter weather, and the combination of snow and ash created a toxic slurry that made outdoor movement extremely dangerous. My shop became an emergency shelter for over 40 people during the storm, far exceeding its intended capacity, but providing the only adequately heated space available to network members whose heating systems had failed. The emergency supplies I'd been storing in the basement kept everyone alive, but the consumption rate meant that food reserves would be exhausted within days if we couldn't return to normal resource sharing arrangements. The crowded conditions created interpersonal conflicts that hadn't existed when people were living in separate locations. Personal space was non-existent, privacy was impossible, and the stress of survival was amplified by constant proximity to other desperate people. I found myself mediating disputes about resource allocation, sleeping arrangements, and personal hygiene issues that seemed trivial compared to survival concerns, but were crucial for maintaining group cohesion. Maya proved invaluable during the shelter period, helping to organize activities for younger children and coordinate clothing repairs that kept people warm and dry during the emergency. Her ability to remain calm under pressure and find practical solutions to immediate problems demonstrated leadership skills that were remarkable for someone her age. She was also instrumental in maintaining communication with network members who were sheltering in other locations, ensuring that our mutual aid systems continued functioning despite the crisis. The storm also revealed how vulnerable our network was to coordinated attacks during emergency conditions. When people were crowded together for warmth and safety, we lost the distributed security advantages that made us difficult targets for organized raids. Dr. Sarah pointed out that the Frozen would be dealing with the same weather emergency, but their organizational structure might allow them to respond more quickly once conditions improved. Reports from other parts of the city during the blizzard were extremely disturbing. Several mutual aid networks had collapsed entirely under the pressure of providing emergency shelter and resources, and the Frozen was actively recruiting survivors who'd been abandoned by other groups. Their message was simple and effective. Individual cooperation networks were too fragile to provide reliable protection during serious emergencies, but gang membership offered guaranteed access to resources and security regardless of weather conditions. The intelligence that Mrs. Chen was receiving suggested that the Frozen was using the blizzard as an opportunity to consolidate control over larger areas of southeast Portland. Groups that had successfully resisted recruitment efforts before the storm were being contacted again with improved offers and more explicit threats. The gang's membership had increased substantially as people who'd exhausted other survival options accepted protection arrangements that they'd previously refused. When the blizzard finally ended on July 8th, we emerged to find a fundamentally changed environment. The snow hadn't melted because temperatures were remaining below freezing even during daylight hours, and the accumulation was blocking roads and making building access difficult. Several structures in our immediate area had suffered damage from wind and snow loads that exceeded their design specifications. But the most significant change was the message that was waiting for us when we returned to normal operations. The Frozen had left a formal ultimatum at my shop, written on official-looking paper and signed by someone calling himself the regional commander. The message was professionally composed and completely unambiguous. Our network had 72 hours to accept incorporation into their organization, or face systematic elimination of our leadership and seizure of our resources. The ultimatum offered specific terms that were clearly designed to appear reasonable, while ensuring complete submission to gang authority. Network members would be allowed to keep personal possessions and maintain family relationships, but all skilled workers would provide services exclusively for gang operations. Resource allocation would be managed centrally to ensure efficient distribution, and security would be provided by trained personnel who understood the realities of survival in hostile territory. The alternative was described in clinical terms that made the threat clear without explicit violence. Networks that refused incorporation would be classified as hostile organizations that posed threats to regional stability and resource security. Hostile organizations would be dealt with using appropriate measures to protect the safety and welfare of cooperative community members. The language was bureaucratic, but everyone understood what it meant. Marcus analyzed the ultimatum from a tactical perspective and concluded that the Frozen had gathered detailed intelligence about our capabilities and vulnerabilities. The timing of their offer, immediately after a natural disaster that had strained our resources and revealed our limitations, suggested sophisticated planning and patience. They weren't acting impulsively or emotionally. They were implementing a systematic strategy for territorial expansion. The 72-hour deadline was psychologically calculated to prevent extended deliberation and consensus building among network members. It forced us to make crucial decisions under time pressure while we were still recovering from the blizzard and dealing with immediate survival concerns. The gang understood that hasty decisions made under stress were more likely to favor their interests than careful consideration of alternatives. Dr. Sarah was adamant that accepting their offer would be a betrayal of everything our network represented. She'd seen what happened to people living under gang protection, and the arrangement was fundamentally exploitative despite the security and resource guarantees. Medical care was provided only to people who contributed adequate value to gang operations, and elderly or disabled people were gradually excluded from resource distribution as their usefulness declined. But other network members were less certain about resistance, especially after experiencing the vulnerabilities that the blizzard had revealed. Families with young children were particularly concerned about the risks of continued independence, and some people were arguing that gang membership might provide better long-term survival prospects than trying to maintain autonomous cooperation under increasingly difficult conditions. The discussions that followed were the most difficult conversations I'd ever participated in as a community leader. People were weighing abstract principles against immediate survival needs, and there were no clear answers about which choice offered better prospects for protecting the things we valued most. Individual freedom and cooperative decision-making were important, but they weren't worth much if choosing them meant watching children freeze to death. Maya participated in these discussions with maturity that was both impressive and heartbreaking. She understood the implications of both choices better than many adults, and she was able to articulate concerns about long-term consequences that others were overlooking due to immediate stress. Her perspective was that accepting gang protection would mean giving up the community relationships that had kept her family alive, even if it provided short-term security guarantees. On July 10th, we received intelligence that made our decision easier, but our situation more dangerous. The teenager who'd been providing information about the Frozen's operations reported that our network was being used as a test case for incorporation procedures that would be applied to other resistance groups throughout the region. If they could successfully force our submission through ultimatum and deadline pressure, they would use the same tactics against larger and better organized networks. The strategic implications were clear. Successful resistance by our network would slow the Frozen's expansion and provide other groups with proof that organized defense was possible. But failure would accelerate gang consolidation throughout southeast Portland and eliminate one of the few remaining examples of successful autonomous cooperation. The pressure we were facing wasn't just about our immediate survival. It was about the future of community self-determination in the post-volcanic world. Marcus recommended that we respond to the ultimatum by initiating contact with other resistance networks and proposing coordinated defensive action. Individual groups were vulnerable to the divide-and-conquer tactics that the Frozen was using, but multiple networks acting simultaneously could overwhelm their capacity to maintain control through intimidation and focused violence. The risks were enormous, but the alternative was systematic elimination of everyone who refused gang authority. That evening, as we prepared our response to the ultimatum, I realized that my role had evolved far beyond anything I'd intended when I started providing tailoring services to desperate neighbors. I was now responsible for decisions that would determine whether dozens of people lived or died, and whether our model of cooperative survival would continue to exist as an alternative to gang protection arrangements. The secondary workshop, where I'd been storing emergency supplies and equipment, became our coordination center for planning resistance operations. The location was completely hidden from gang surveillance, and it provided secure space for storing weapons and supplies that would be essential if negotiation failed to resolve the crisis. Maya was responsible for maintaining communication between our network and allied groups who were facing similar ultimatums. I spent July 11th creating detailed contingency plans for different scenarios, knowing that our survival would depend on rapid adaptation to changing circumstances during the confrontation period. The instruction manual that documented our community's accumulated survival knowledge was distributed to multiple secure locations, ensuring that essential information would survive even if individual network members didn't. But even as we prepared for the worst possible outcomes, I was determined to exhaust every alternative to direct violence before accepting that community cooperation could only be preserved through force. The evening of July 11th, I was finalizing our response to the Frozen's ultimatum, knowing that our answer would determine whether the next few days brought negotiated settlement or open warfare between two very different visions of how people should organize themselves for survival in the new world we were all learning to navigate. July 12th arrived with clear skies and temperatures that remained below freezing despite the summer date. Our deadline was approaching rapidly, and the Frozen expected our answer by evening. But instead of sending a response to their ultimatum, Marcus and I were implementing the rescue plan we developed for retrieving our people who'd been captured during supply runs over the past week. 3 network members, including Marcus's assistant, had been taken while scavenging for heating fuel, and the Frozen was using them as additional leverage to force our compliance with their incorporation demands. The rescue mission required every tactical advantage we could create using materials and knowledge that most people wouldn't consider militarily useful. I'd spent the previous night creating camouflage clothing that would allow our rescue team to move through the snow-covered urban landscape without being detected by gang sentries. The garments were constructed from white fabric, gray wool, and carefully placed patches that broke up human silhouettes against the mixed snow and ash that covered most surfaces. Marcus had identified the location where our people were being held based on intelligence from the teenager who'd been feeding us information about gang operations. The building was a former community center that the Frozen had converted into a detention facility and supply depot. The structure was familiar to me because I'd attended neighborhood meetings there before the volcanic eruptions, and my knowledge of the building's layout was crucial for planning entry and exit routes that would avoid heavily guarded areas. Maya was coordinating communication between our rescue team and the network members who were maintaining normal operations at our primary locations. Her role was essential because any deviation from routine activities would signal to gang surveillance that we were implementing active resistance measures. She was also responsible for emergency evacuation procedures if the rescue mission triggered broader retaliation against our remaining people and resources. The infiltration itself was terrifying in ways that my peacetime experience as a tailor hadn't prepared me for. Moving through hostile territory while wearing gear I'd constructed by hand, trying to avoid detection by people who would kill us without hesitation, represented a complete departure from everything I'd understood about my capabilities and limitations. But the alternative was abandoning people who'd risked their lives to help keep our community supplied with essential resources. The building's heating system and insulation were details I remembered from attending meetings there, and that knowledge proved crucial for understanding which areas would be occupied and which would be too cold for extended guard duty. We entered through a maintenance access that I recalled from helping set up chairs for community events, using keys that Marcus had acquired through contacts with city maintenance workers who joined other survival networks. Finding our people required systematic searching through areas where the Frozen was storing captured supplies and equipment from multiple raids throughout southeast Portland. The scope of their operations was much larger than we'd realized, with resources taken from dozens of independent groups who'd refused incorporation or been eliminated for other reasons. Medical supplies, tools, preserved food, and winter clothing were organized in quantities that represented months of accumulation. Marcus and David were being held in a converted storage room with 2 other captives from different networks, and their condition was worse than we'd expected. They'd been given minimal food and water, and the cold storage area had no heating during a period when nighttime temperatures were dropping well below freezing. David had developed symptoms of pneumonia, and Marcus was suffering from infected cuts that had been deliberately left untreated to increase pressure for information about our defensive capabilities. The extraction required careful timing to avoid guards and minimize noise that would alert other gang members to our presence. Marcus could walk, but David needed assistance, and the additional captives complicated our escape plans because we couldn't abandon them without compromising our operational security. The teenager who'd been providing intelligence had mentioned that gang policy was to execute witnesses who could identify detention facility locations. Getting everyone out of the building safely required using knowledge of fabric properties and construction techniques that had nothing to do with traditional military tactics. I created improvised stretchers from reinforcing materials and climbing equipment, and I modified our camouflage clothing to provide additional insulation for people who'd been weakened by exposure and malnutrition. The rescue mission succeeded, but it also revealed how much our situation had deteriorated while we'd been focused on negotiations and defensive preparations. The intelligence we gathered during the rescue mission confirmed our worst fears about the Frozen's expansion plans. They were systematically eliminating independent survival networks throughout southeast Portland and incorporating useful members into a hierarchical organization that was more sophisticated than any of us had realized. Leadership positions were assigned based on demonstrated value to gang operations, and people who couldn't contribute adequately were relocated to areas with minimal resources and no security protection. July 15th brought the final confrontation that we'd been dreading since the ultimatum deadline had passed. The Frozen launched a coordinated assault on our primary locations, using tactics that demonstrated professional military planning rather than the improvised violence we'd expected from street criminals. They attacked the shop, Dr. Sarah's clinic, and Marcus's garage simultaneously, using sufficient personnel to overwhelm any individual location while preventing us from coordinating mutual support. The battle at my shop lasted nearly 4 hours, and it was unlike anything I'd ever imagined experiencing as a peacetime craftsman. The reinforcements we'd installed held against initial attempts to force entry, but the Frozen had brought tools and equipment specifically designed for breaching fortified positions. They used portable heaters to melt snow for water to extinguish the heating fires that were keeping us warm, and they systematically destroyed windows and exterior walls to eliminate our weather protection. Maya's coordination of repair efforts during the fighting was remarkable and probably saved several lives. As gang members damaged our defensive positions, she organized teams of network members to implement emergency repairs using materials and techniques I'd taught during our community workshops. Torn tarps were replaced with fabric patches, broken windows were sealed with improvised coverings, and damaged heating systems were modified to continue functioning despite structural damage to the building. The community we'd built over the past 4 months rallied to defend our shop in ways that exceeded every expectation I'd had about civilian resistance capabilities. Mrs. Chen coordinated intelligence about gang positions and movements from her observation post across the street. Robert used his knowledge of building construction to identify structural vulnerabilities that could be exploited for defensive advantages. David, despite his recent captivity and illness, helped organize supply distribution and casualty care during the extended siege. Dr. Sarah's medical expertise was crucial for treating injuries sustained during the fighting, but her supplies were limited, and the conditions were far from ideal for providing surgical care. She improvised medical tools from sewing equipment and created surgical sutures from silk thread that I provided from my remaining high-quality materials. The medical textiles I'd been producing for her clinic proved essential for controlling bleeding and preventing infection in wounds that would have been fatal without immediate treatment. The turning point came when the Frozen realized that our resistance was more organized and effective than their intelligence had suggested. Instead of facing isolated individuals who would surrender quickly when overwhelmed, they encountered a coordinated defense network that had prepared extensively for siege conditions and was willing to accept significant casualties rather than submit to gang authority. Their tactical advantage depended on quick victories that minimized their own losses, and extended fighting was depleting their personnel faster than they could afford. The victory wasn't decisive in any traditional military sense, but it achieved our primary objective of demonstrating that organized resistance was possible and potentially successful. The Frozen withdrew from our immediate area after taking casualties that apparently exceeded their acceptable limits for incorporating a single network. More importantly, word of our successful defense spread to other resistance groups throughout the region, providing proof that gang expansion could be stopped through collective action and careful preparation. But the cost of victory was substantial in ways that extended far beyond immediate casualties and property damage. Several network members had been seriously injured, our supply reserves were largely exhausted, and the infrastructure we'd built for community survival had suffered damage that would take weeks to repair under normal conditions. Dr. Sarah was treating injuries with supplies that couldn't be replaced, and our heating fuel reserves were nearly depleted just as winter weather was intensifying. The shop itself was barely functional after the assault, with damaged windows, compromised insulation, and structural problems that affected both security and weather protection. The secondary workshop became our primary operational center, but it lacked the space and equipment needed to serve the entire network's clothing and repair needs. Maya and I worked around the clock to establish temporary production capabilities while coordinating reconstruction efforts for our main facility. July 20th marked the beginning of a new phase in our community's development as we transitioned from defensive resistance to establishing permanent settlement structures. The school building that we'd identified as a potential fortified shelter became the foundation for a larger, more resilient community that could withstand future challenges, while maintaining the cooperative principles that had enabled our survival during the initial crisis period. The organizational knowledge that I documented in the instruction manual became the basis for formal governance structures that distributed leadership responsibilities among network members with relevant expertise. Maya was appointed to coordinate educational programs that would preserve essential skills and knowledge for future generations. Dr. Sarah established medical training requirements that would ensure community health capabilities. Marcus organized infrastructure development projects that would improve our long-term sustainability. The reputation of our successful resistance attracted refugees from failed networks throughout southeast Portland, and our population increased from fewer than 50 people to more than 200 within 2 weeks. The rapid growth created resource pressures that required careful management, but it also provided the human capital needed for larger construction projects and more sophisticated survival systems. Teaching programs became crucial for integrating new community members and preserving the accumulated knowledge that represented our primary advantage over less organized groups. I established formal apprenticeships for advanced textile work, while other network members created training programs for mechanical skills, medical knowledge, food preservation, and the countless other capabilities required for independent survival in the post-volcanic world. July 25th brought the first formal contact with other survivor settlements beyond the Portland metropolitan area, and the communication revealed both opportunities and challenges that we hadn't anticipated. Radio operators had established long-distance networks that connected communities throughout the Pacific Northwest, and the information exchange suggested that successful settlements were developing different approaches to organization and resource management. Some communities had adopted centralized authority structures similar to the Frozen, but based on democratic elections rather than violence and intimidation. Others had developed specialized trading relationships that allowed communities to focus on particular types of production while acquiring other necessities through exchange agreements. The diversity of approaches suggested that multiple models for post-disaster society were viable under different circumstances. The long-distance communications also revealed the global scope of the crisis we were navigating. The volcanic winter was affecting agricultural production worldwide, and government services had collapsed in most developed countries as infrastructure systems failed under unexpected environmental pressures. The communities that were successfully adapting were primarily small, locally organized groups that could make decisions quickly and implement solutions using immediately available resources. Planning for summer expeditions to establish contact with other settlements became a priority as we realized that isolation was limiting our access to resources and knowledge that could improve our survival prospects. Maya was selected to participate in the advanced planning because her communication skills and adaptability made her valuable for establishing relationships with communities that might have different cultural approaches to cooperation and resource sharing. The instruction manual had evolved into a comprehensive guide for community organization that other settlements were requesting copies of through the radio networks. The knowledge we'd accumulated during our first 4 months of independent survival was apparently valuable to communities facing similar challenges, and the exchange relationships we were developing provided access to information and resources that weren't available locally. July 30th arrived with a mixture of cautious optimism and realistic acknowledgement of the enormous challenges that remained ahead. 1 month of demonstrated survival had proven that our cooperative model was viable under extreme conditions, but the approaching winter would test our capabilities in ways that we couldn't fully prepare for. Food preservation, fuel management, and shelter maintenance would become more difficult as temperatures continued dropping and supply options became more limited. The community we'd accidentally created through mutual aid and shared survival needs had evolved into something that none of us had planned, but all of us valued enough to defend against people who would have destroyed it for short-term resource gains. The shop that had started as my individual business had become the heart of a settlement that represented an alternative approach to organizing human society under crisis conditions. Looking back on the 30 days that had transformed us from individual survivors into a functioning community, I was struck by how much had changed, not just in our external circumstances, but in our understanding of what was possible when people chose cooperation over competition during times of extreme scarcity. My grandmother's lessons about survival through skilled craftsmanship had provided the foundation, but the structure we'd built extended far beyond anything she could have envisioned. The reports we were receiving through radio communications suggested that similar communities were developing throughout the regions affected by the volcanic winter, and that the connections between these settlements would determine whether human civilization could adapt successfully to permanently changed environmental conditions. The next phase of our survival would depend not just on maintaining our local community, but on building relationships with other groups who shared our commitment to cooperation and mutual aid. 30 days had taught us that we could survive when everything we'd taken for granted about modern life disappeared permanently. Now, we faced the more complex challenge of learning how to build something better than what we'd lost, using the knowledge and relationships that crisis had forced us to develop. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since the ash started falling, I believed that we might not just survive, but actually create communities worth surviving for.